Today we're continuing our year-long look at the Ten Commandments in conjunction with the Presbyterian Women's Bible Study. So you may remember each month the study for Presbyterian women as they meet in the next Monday and Tuesdays ahead focuses on a particular commandment. On the Sunday before that, we're taking a look at that commandment here in worship. Today the commandment that we're looking at is the fourth commandment, the commandment on Sabbath. I'm going to be reading from the version in the book of Exodus, sometimes what's called the book of the covenant. You may remember there are two versions of the Ten Commandments, one in the book of Exodus and one in the book of Deuteronomy. And one of the interesting things is the consistency, the repetition of word for word of the sets of the commandments as we find them in both places, although there are some differences. And in particular, around this commandment, the fourth commandment, the book of Exodus and the book of Deuteronomy, both have different reasons, rationales, or motivation for observing the commandment. Here, as I read from the book of Exodus, you'll hear the emphasis on the creation story in the book of Genesis. And it reminds us that so much of Exodus and the experience of the people of God, even as they're being freed from Egypt, has reference to God's creative activity, all the way back to the story of creation. Deuteronomy, in its list of the commandments, in particular the fourth commandment, emphasizes the rationale of remembering the experience of the Exodus itself, remembering the experience of deliverance from slavery, because Deuteronomy goes on to invoke this commandment as a cause for you to remember your own experience so that you treat the slaves in your midst, the servants in your midst, the foreigners in your midst, in the same way that God treated you as God delivered you from slavery. But reading from the book of Exodus, chapter 20, verses 8 through 11. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you, your son or your daughter, your male or female slave, your livestock, or alien resident in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and the sea and all that is in them, but rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it. And then turning to the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 12, verses 1 through 8, we hear one of the stories in which Jesus deals with the understanding of the commandment on the Sabbath and the experience of those in his day. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry, and they began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. When the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath." Jesus said to them, "Have you not read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God and ate the bread of the presence, which it was not lawful for him or his companions to eat, but only for the priest. Or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priest and the temple break the Sabbath and yet are guiltless? I tell you, something greater than the temple is here. But if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." He left that place and entered their synagogue, and a man was there with a withered hand, and they asked him, "Is it lawful to cure on the Sabbath?" so that they might accuse him. And he said to them, "Suppose one of you has only one sheep, and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath. Will you not lay hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a human being than a sheep? So it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." Then he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and it was restored, as sound as the other. But the Pharisees went out and conspired against him, how to destroy him. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Let us pray. Almighty God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight. O God, our rock and our redeemer. Amen. Margaret Wrinkle is a newspaper columnist who frequently writes columns for the New York Times, but she's based in Nashville, Tennessee, and most of her columns in some way reflect her own experience and upbringing in Southern culture. A number of weeks ago, she had a column entitled, "Remember the Sabbath and Keep It Holy." And in the column, she remembered and reflected on the life of her great-grandmother, Ollie. And she remembered her great-grandmother's practice of coming home every day on the Sabbath, every Sabbath, coming home from church and then retiring to her room and not doing anything else the whole rest of the day. And it was always a sense of amazement to her because her great-grandmother was always so busy doing something, whether it was shelling the snap beans out on the front porch or sewing with her sewing machine. She had one of those old sewing machines that worked by the foot pedal, and she said her grandmother would be at that machine 6 days a week and that foot pedal would be flying. But on the Sabbath, she would come home from church and then retire to her room, often to be seen sitting in her room with her familiar worn Bible sitting on her lap. She said she remembered that even though her great-grandmother Ollie moved from town to town, even though she had been a Baptist most all of her life, as she became dependent on her children and her grandchildren's care and went to live with them, she started to attend church where she was attending. So it didn't make any difference whether she had gone to the Baptist church in the morning or the Methodist church in the morning or even the Catholic Mass in Birmingham later on. On the Sabbath, she came home from worship, retired to her room, and remained there quietly for the rest of the day. Margaret said it brought back to her a memory that in some ways had become kind of painful for her because she remembered how, as a small child, she herself had been doing a kind of handwork called tatting. I'm sure some of you all know that better than I do, even as I just talk about it, but it has to do with tying little knots and very thin strings. It makes a kind of lace. It's very delicate and complicated work. And Margaret said she remembered one Sunday she herself had been working on some tatting, and she got the knots all tangled up, so immediately she went back into her great-grandmother Ollie's room and said, "Mother Ollie, can you help me with this handwork? Can you help me untangle these knots?" And great-grandmother Ollie said to her, "Dear child, I'm so sorry, but not on the Lord's day. We are not supposed to work." And Margaret says now she looks back on that and she wonders if that caused her great-grandmother a great deal of heartache to have to disappoint this great-grandchild whom she loved so much, but nevertheless would not veer from or break away from her discipline of observing the Sabbath and not doing what she considered to be work, even to help her great-granddaughter. And Margaret says she carried a sense of guilt, even now as an adult, for in some ways having tempted her great-grandmother and offering an opportunity to break her Sabbath commitment. Now, Margaret goes on to reflect in this column, in this article, how she herself had completely lost a sense of Sabbath in her own life, primarily a sense of rest and renewal. And she related an experience of having just returned from a whirlwind book tour where she's completely worn out. And she returned home on a Sunday, and as was her custom on Sunday, she immediately got up and went to her computer to try and answer emails and tie together other loose ends and look through some chores that she hadn't been able to get done while she was gone another time. And she found herself so tired, so exhausted, that her head kept going down on her desk and she kept falling asleep, and she couldn't get to any of these things that she needed to do. And she realized and recognized her own deep need for rest and renewal, and the way her body was telling her, you can't always just work. You have to stop sometimes. So she said it became a moment, a chance for her to go out and take a walk in a beautiful park in Nashville and enjoy the nature and the landscape and the beginning of fall and the different animals that she would see there became a very renewing and restful time for her. And she raised the question, she wondered, even as she remembered her grandmother Ollie, great-grandmother Ollie, she wondered if the stillness itself really wasn't where the holiness existed. That was a very interesting way of thinking about her own needs, her own need for rest, and the witness of her great-grandmother and its influence for her across her lives. It was also amazing to me the number of people that wrote in and commented on that article. Who would have thought that more than 500 people would write in comments to the New York Times about Sabbath keeping? But people from every walk of life, every experience wrote in, many saying, I'm not religious, I'm an atheist, da-da-da. But almost everyone said, we recognize and understand and have a deep need for rest. And so the idea of stopping is important. Certainly, Margaret Wrinkle captures this common human wisdom, this good sense, this need that we all have for rest. A need that's embodied itself in this fourth commandment. A commandment which says one of the things that we are to do, or not do rather, one of the things we're not to do on the Sabbath is to work. The Sabbath is a time for stopping. But it also seems to me that she failed to recognize the import and the significance of the commandment for us as people of faith, as the people of God, as people of both the Old Testament and the New Testament, and the force of its prescribed behavior for us. The force of remembering that on the Sabbath, we're called to set this day, to set this time apart for God, called to consecrate it and make it holy. And as well, we're called to stop and to not work. You see, the Sabbath, and I think this is important for us to remember, as is probably true for all for all the commandments. The commandments, and particularly this commandment on the Sabbath, is not just another way or technique for us to turn to for our own sense of well-being. It's not for us to just take this and say, everybody needs to stop working for a while and get some rest. That's true in and of itself. But the commandment comes to us as a deep and important expression of God's will for us in particular, of God's creative purposes for humankind, not just for humankind, but for all of creation. I think there's a little bit of a danger that we might miss the gift in the commandment, the word of grace, the very gospel itself, of setting aside a day, a time for the Lord, of consecrating it and keeping it holy and not doing any work in that time. Now, it will take all of Scripture, and we can see how it continues to unfold in Scripture, what exactly this means not to do any work and what it means to keep something holy for God. We see Jesus engaged in that debate and that argument even in the passage we read from the New Testament. But nevertheless, here in the commandment itself is this very basic gift of God, this word of grace given to us in particular and to humankind as a whole. I intend for life to be good, for life not to be exploited by any other god or gods, for life not to be turned into a technique for you to try and master it in and of yourselves. Here's a gift from God, a word of grace in which God says, remember, observe, and keep. It's a subtle difference, but a very important one and a significant one. It helps us to remember and understand that in this commandment, but in all the commandments in general, there is a routinization of our common life. There is a way of living together that gives us structure and meaning and significance. And following and understanding and embracing those structures and the significance as they come to us as an expression of God's will is at the heart of the good words that God speaks to us in the commandment. In other words, as we focus on this commandment of Sabbath, on this commandment of stopping, it suggests that there really is a difference between simply stopping work and taking a day off, a difference between that and stopping doing everything that we're doing and sanctifying a time for God and setting it apart as a time for God. There is a way of life embodied in this instruction, embodied in this good word that interweaves us and creates for us and shapes us into the kind of community and the kind of life that is nourishing, that is fulfilling, that is full of care that God intends for us. Care both for God and our worship of God, and care for one another in the way that we treat one another, in the way that we call upon one another, in the way that we relate to one another in all the activities that we're involved in. Here in this Sabbath commandment is in many ways the very commandment that Jesus calls the greatest commandment, the love of God and the love of neighbor. And we should always remember to try and receive this as a gift, not simply as an obligation, a burden, or a duty, although when we remember the obligation and the duty, they bring to it a kind of force which helps our lives to take content and shape. But at its very heart is a gift. The great Jewish rabbi Abraham Heschel says that in the Sabbath we have a sanctuary in time whereby we can step back in to the creative and redemptive work in God. Once a week, God gives us the opportunity to set aside a time and a place for us to intentionally to step back in to the stream of God's creative work, a stream we might also remember symbolized in baptism, and to receive once again the source of God's goodwill for us, a source which we might also see in the gift of this table, the food prepared for us, the nurturing of our deep inner lives by the gift of God's love for us. In this sanctuary, physically this building, in this sanctuary of time, we have an opportunity to once again step back into the stream and sit down at the source of God's love for us. And it reminds us of the very nature of life as a gift of God and a work of God's grace. Life, as you may well know, can look very different, can look very, very different, and be experienced very differently. Think about Chris Christopherson's ballad, Sunday Morning Coming Down. And think about the life he describes in that, particularly the life on Sunday morning when he sings, "Well, I woke up on a Sunday morning with no way to hold my head that didn't hurt, and the beer I had for breakfast wasn't bad, so I had one for dessert. Then I fumbled through my closet for my clothes and found my cleanest dirty shirt. I shaved my face and combed my hair and stumbled down the stairs to meet the day. I smoked my brain the night before with cigarettes and songs that I've been picking, but I lit my first and watched a small kid cussing a can that he was kicking." Christopherson's finding himself at odds, isolated, alone on a Sunday morning, cut off from community by whatever behaviors had governed him up to that point. And he goes on to sing, "Then I crossed the empty street and caught the Sunday smell of someone frying chicken. And it took me back to something that I'd lost somehow, somewhere along the way. On the Sunday morning sidewalk, wishing, Lord, that I was stoned, because there's something in a Sunday that makes a body feel alone. And there's nothing short of dying half as lonesome as the sound on a sleeping city sidewalk Sunday morning coming down. Life isn't always experienced in the stream of the font or the gift of the table. Life is lived and experienced sometimes, we know, in very destructive and harmful ways. In the park, I saw a daddy with a laughing little girl. He was swinging, and I stopped beside the Sunday school and listened to the song that they were singing. Then I headed back for home, and somewhere far away, a lonely bell was ringing, and it echoed through the canyon like the disappearing dreams of yesterday. There's nothing short of dying half as lonesome as the sound of the sleeping city sidewalk Sunday morning coming down. That's the antithesis of the picture of life that God intends for us in the commandment of the Sabbath. Remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. On the seventh day you shall rest, because God rested on the seventh day, because God ceased from God's work on the seventh day. And there's gift for that in you. There's a way of life which brings you again in the community of love that comes to us through God and is known in the company of God's faithful people, that is known in the great cloud of witnesses who cheer and encourage us to continue to run the race set before us. It's so interesting to me that our observation of this commandment falls on Sunday closest to All Saints' Day. And it makes me call to mind the lives of saints in this particular congregation who over the years have continually encouraged me and set before me a way of living in the midst of God's graciousness and God's love and God's goodness that is good for all of us. I think of a gentleman many of you would remember, many probably don't know, Cliff Duty, a full retired colonel in the Army who sat with his diminutive wife. You could barely see her, Jean Duty, over the pews sometimes. She was so small, but they sat together week after week after week, coming faithfully and working for this church as a couple. And one of the reasons I remember Cliff Duty, because there was always an inconsistency in my own mind and expectation of what somebody who was a full bird colonel should look like. Because one of the first impressions I had of Cliff Duty was when I worked here as a summer intern and was told that there was an elder in the church, a man, a full colonel, who was going to work with you on middle school activities for the summer. He had arranged various trips for the middle school to take with you, and they called it a middle school caravan, and he would go along with you the first couple of times just to keep the middle schoolers in shape. And so here appeared Cliff Duty, this fella from Texarkana, sort of round and sort of like a bowling pin, and he had Bermuda shorts on that went all the way down to his knees and white stockings that came up from his ankles to meet those Bermuda shorts in the middle. And I thought these middle school kids are going to run as soon as they seen this guy. But there was no one more full of love and care and attention for those kids, and he had arranged for us to visit the Orthodox Church and the Jewish synagogue and the Church of Latter-day Saints across the summer, and he rode with us, and the kids loved listening to the stories of Mr. Cliff. They loved being taught how to play golf with him. And I remember the stories he told me of his time in Vietnam early on, before the U.S. had fully gotten involved there, and the friendships he made with some of the Vietnamese, and in particular, a young man who became a Catholic priest, and the letters that they shared, and the encouragement he gave to him across the years. And I remember the letters Cliff Duty wrote to me while I was in seminary, as he was my liaison under care here at this church. I remember Julia House, another force to be reckoned with in the life of Presbyterian women, who one day, as the Presbyterian women were working with the child care center, and the child care center reported that they needed a new dishwasher, Julia asked, well, who makes those kind of dishwashers? And before you knew it, she was calling manufacturers all across Tennessee, and she was telling them, you know, what you really need to do is donate this dishwasher to the Park Lake Presbyterian Church, because there's children here who need clean dishes to eat off of. And I kept thinking, what in the world is she up to? No one's going to pay any attention to some lady calling from here saying, you need to donate a dishwasher. Well, lo and behold, a few weeks later, here came a dishwasher donated to the Child Care Center of Park Lake Presbyterian Church, because this woman saw a need and decided that the women of this congregation could take care of it. And I think of another saint who recently joined that great cloud of witnesses, the Reverend Nedson Zulu, who was here with us last fall on one of his annual trips over to the States to tell us about the work that was being done there in Mozambique, the water wells that we had helped to drill together, the congregations and their sanctuaries that we had helped to build, the roofs that we had put on them. And you know as well as I do that when Nedson was here, he was always very quiet, somewhat reserved, just with a big smile, and it was a little bit hard to get out of him just something that he was thinking about, but he was thinking about something. Yet the moment that he would get up in this pulpit, or the moment he would stand in front of the stage at Struble Hall, his face would light up and he would launch into an evangelistic appeal, just as though he were presenting it there out in the rural areas of Mozambique. And I remember that good saint and the words of encouragement he brought to us each time he visited. And I think about Reverend Bob Gray, who died a few months ago, a long-time beloved pastor of this congregation, whose ministry certainly shaped and influenced mine. But more significantly, I think about the relationships that Bob had with so many people here in this congregation. And I think of two other wonderful saints of this church whom you may know. One woman, Alberta Dothrow, used to sit back about where David and Milan are, week after week, very quiet, would hardly ever say anything. But her daughter, Glenda Jo Lefevre, just told me recently that on a trip to Jerusalem, that the trip of a lifetime that she got to attend with a group from Park Lake and Dr. Gray, she wanted to ride a donkey up one of the hills in Jerusalem, and no one would go with her. And the group was about ready to leave until Dr. Gray said, no, let's stop. I'll ride up the donkey, up the hill in Jerusalem with Alberta Dothrow. And it made the trip for her, and she loved him for it. And I remember the story of Mildred Horn. Some of you may remember Mildred, another great saint of this church from Rocky Mount, North Carolina, who had a southern drawl that was like maple syrup on cornbread, could melt you as she talked to you. And I remember her telling us how she went to Scotland with Dr. Gray and a group. And the one thing she wanted to do in Scotland was to put her feet in the North Sea. But the tour bus said, we don't have time to do that, until Dr. Gray said, no, stop the bus. And the two of them got out, walked out, rolled their pants legs up, took off their socks, and stood together in the North Sea. And it was those kinds of relationships, that kind of love, that kind of care, which made him beloved in this community, which to me I still see him doing in the great cloud of witnesses, even as he encourages all of us, even if you may not have known him. It reminds me of something that I want to show you quickly. Some of you may have a plate like this at your house. It says, "This is your day, celebrate." It was the birthday plate in our house. Some of you may have it. Whoever's birthday it was got to eat off of this plate. You know, it seems to me that this is a plate that also belongs on this table. Because as we gather here, we're reminded that this is God's day. This is the day of the Lord. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. And remember the bread and the cup that are put on this plate, and remember the gift of life itself. To take time for that, and to keep it holy, and to not let anything else that you think you've got to get done, or the world will just stop. Not so. The world may stop, But God's love continues to flow here, always.